You're listening to Table Talks for Life, a Y4Life podcast that prepares youth to be gospel-motivated voices for life. Be sure to stick around after today's live recording to find out how you can be engaged in upholding life too. Welcome to Table Talks for Life. We are so excited that you're joining us today. Today, we're going to talk about preparing to love for life. And I am here with three other guests. My name is Michelle Bauman. I am the director of Y4Life. And I'm going to go ahead and have my guests introduce themselves.
I'm Corey. I'm the Y4Life assistant.
And I'm Pastor Jonathan Petzold. I serve as the senior pastor at Trinity Lutheran Church in Roselle, Illinois.
And I'm Christa Petzold. So I'm married to Pastor Jonathan, and I have 4 kids, and I homeschool them.
I have 4 kids.
Yes, you share that.
Yeah.
Wonderful. All right. So we're going to talk about kind of a hot topic for young people today, and that is the concept of love. What does real love look like, right? What does the world say about love? But we're going to start with some of those definitions. In particular, I want to start with definitions that society gives us. And then we're going to contrast that with what God says about those same things. So I'm hoping that today we can kind of discuss, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? And what is sex and what is it for, right? According to society. We're going to start there. So who wants to jump in? Should we start? Let's start with man. What does it mean to be a man in today's society?
Yeah. So, well, I'm not a man, so I don't know. I think our society tells us that, or at least the current move in society is to say that there is no difference between men and women. That they're kind of, that there's maybe like a spectrum, or just that there's not really anything distinct, and that you get to kind of craft your own version of being a man or being a woman based around, I don't know, whatever you want, I guess. So instead of there being an actual essence of what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman, it's more based on your experience. So your experience of yourself determines your reality.
So it's like an identity that you find in yourself.
Yeah.
That's not like defined for you already, kind of thing.
Yeah. So I don't know. I think there are a lot of different ways that people might define what it means to be a man, but I think in general, there's definitely this sense that masculinity is toxic.
Yes.
So, like, you don't want to be too much of a man because that's seen as a negative. And then, like, on the flip side, femininity is seen as being kind of weak. Right. So like women are trying not to be too feminine and men are trying not to be too masculine. And we're all just kind of like thrown into this middle realm of just don't be objectionable and do whatever you want.
Right. Yeah, I think it's interesting, so we can talk biology and we can talk gender, right? So biology, even biology is questioned today, right? Whether it's male, whether a person is male or female, can a person be male but be presented in the wrong body? We've had these discussions a lot at Lutherans for Life, but I think you kind of hit it on the head in the sense that there's no definitive, as far as from my perspective, but I will definitely appreciate hearing from you, Pastor. There's no definitive definition for man, for maleness, for manhood, with the exception of the negative definition, right? What you shouldn't be. The world is quick to define what men shouldn't be, and you use that toxic masculinity phrase, right? So you shouldn't be some of these traditional male stereotypes where you shouldn't be strong, and you shouldn't be a hunter, and you shouldn't be the guy who wants to protect others. Those are things, according to society, that you shouldn't be.
Right. And I think you got a couple challenges that society has with this stuff, where I think we already kind of talked about how we so often try to find our identity inside of ourselves, and we want to make that identity for ourselves. And especially if you're still trying to figure out who you are, and I think that often happens in middle school, high school. It's like society has said, well, gender is one of those factors that you've got to figure out, that you got to try to find out who you are, and it might be a man or a woman or whatever. And so we've really separated that from biology, and I think that some of that kind of comes from some of the challenges that we have about gender and how we understand gender and see gender, right? And I think that probably a lot of it stems from the belief, kind of like we said, that femininity is weak, and so to nobody, I think that's probably where you get kind of like feminism coming from, is that you don't want it to be, you don't want women to be perceived as weak, but strong. And then if you have like a strong masculinity, that kind of, I don't know, it kind of suggests then that well, then if masculinity is strong, then femininity must not be, right? And so I think that you kind of get that kind of that dichotomy where
it's perceived as a threat, like that
right,
strength
right,
is perceived as threatening.
Yeah. So you get that toxic masculinity and that weak femininity.
Mm-hmm. And that idea that they're opposites, when really and hopefully we'll get into this later, they're meant to be complementary, right? Not opposites warring against each other, but complementing each other and working together, right? Your thoughts, Corey?
Oh, yeah, I just was going to say too, I think a lot about how, we see masculinity as toxic, but for some reason femininity isn't. Like, women can't be toxic. I think that's a lot of the definition too, is like, well, men, it's just their nature to be toxic and awful, and women, there's no way they could do that because they've been so oppressed for so long, that feminism coming out there. So I think that's another thing too, when it comes to men and women in society, is just there's no way a woman could ever do anything awful because she's been so oppressed. And we're supposed to, traditionally women have been submissive and all of this. And so there's no way that women could be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's another thing you see a lot today too.
I often think that like today we're like reacting against, I always think of like a 1950s like housewife commercial, like, like in my head. And I think like society like reacts against that, like the traditional gender roles or whatever. And you've got the submissive wife who's, making food in the kitchen, out of a can or whatever, right? And you got the guy that comes home and sits on the sofa from work, and he's got a cigar and a beer and a newspaper, and like we kind of get our bad definitions of these things in our society from that kind of picture.
Sure. And we haven't spent much time talking about women, except for, again, this idea that maybe femininity is weak. And in some regards, I think society encourages women to actually, I think without society even recognizing what it's doing, but becoming some sort of object or other human other than human being, right? So when you think of how women are portrayed, very often when women are portrayed as strong in society, they are sexual, right? Rather than they are caring or motherly, or they are a wife. Their strength comes in their sexuality and in their appeal, ironically, to men, right? In almost objectifying them very often, which of course classical feminism would counter and say, whoa, that's not a good thing. And yet we look today and that's very often how women are portrayed, as powerful objects that may be able to persuade men to do the things that they want to do, right? Like the classic Delilah. And that's not a healthy look either, right? That's not a God-pleasing look. So we've talked about maybe men and women. What about sex in general? The coming together, the desire for one another. What does society say about sex?
Basically, society says that sex is recreational, and it's acceptable. And the only way that it could not be acceptable is if you don't have consent. Like, we're down to that's the only rule surrounding it, I think.
Like it's just an activity, that I just opt into.
And well, beyond that, it's like an activity that is a human right. Like everybody has the right to have sex with whoever they want, with no limits on that, other than it has to be consensual or something.
And then it's like oppressive if you say that somebody can't have sex,
right? Because that becomes folded into people's identity. It's like who I am. Part of that is who I have sex with.
Right. I recorded a podcast a couple of days ago, or maybe it was yesterday. All my days are blurring together. And we talked about how, sex or intercourse or, that used to be, or that still in some cases is seen as kind of the pinnacle point of a relationship, right? A oneness. When we talk about a man and a wife, this is the coming together as one in order to beget a child, and in order to serve the spouse. And yet, that another speaker pointed out that seems to be the goal of every relationship now, right? Not just between man and woman, but even has replaced this closeness of friendship, right? Yeah. The idea that a man can be a friend with a man and a woman can be a friend with a woman. A very deep friendship is almost impossible in society, right? To have just a friendship that doesn't end, again, according to society's rules,
right.
That doesn't end in some sort of sexual encounter.
Yeah, and it's always like assumed to be romantic, or have the potential for a romantic element in some way.
Yeah, that's right. So when we talk about, we want to throw in one more word, and that word would be love. Okay, so society's definition of love, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about God's definition about all these, because I'm feeling sort of like, oh man, this is we got to make sure we get the truth in there, right? So what is society's definition of love then?
I think it's letting me do what I want. Like if you love me, you let me do what I want. And if I love you, it means letting you do what you want. So it's like this, like,
and celebrating that.
Yeah. And you got to celebrate me. I'll celebrate you. But it's very focused on the individual. And so love kind of becomes like self-serving in that I celebrate you as an individual because I want to be celebrated as an individual, which sounds kind of nice on the surface, but it's still very self-centered at its core, right?
It's baseless. Like there's nothing sort of real there. There's nothing underlying it, other than like a sentiment,
right? Good. Go ahead, Corey. I can see you want.
Oh yeah, I was just going to add to that too, of like, we think of it more as like a feeling and not an action either. Like we just feel love for people, but that doesn't carry out into like what we do for them. So there's no tough love anymore either. It's all, you have to affirm. And if you don't affirm, don't say anything at all.
Yeah, I think that's great. Yeah.
Nothing sacrificial about it, right? So in a presentation I do on love and relationships, I talk about love being an action word. Right. That love is an action word. It is doing something. It is not just feeling something. And so, which kind of leads us right into, what does God say? What does God say about all of these things? So which one do you want to start with? You want to start with love?
Let's start with love, because we're on that.
Yeah. What does God say then about love? Well,
I always think of 1 Corinthians 13, because it's a great definition of love, and it's right in the Bible. So love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it is not rude, it is not self-seeking or easily angered. So that's a pretty good start. And then right here, I feel like we really get to where, like, the hard part, like, love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. And I always think about that in June now, because like what it means to love people is to refuse to delight in evil and to rejoice in what is true. And so love, according to God, is grounded in reality and is grounded in truth. So it's not a sentiment. It's not a feeling or what, it is a way of behaving that acknowledges that there is such a thing as truth.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, love and truth are connected, right? And because God is love, and he is both of those things. He is love.
Yeah.
He is truth. He is the source of truth, the founder of truth. And so they can't be separated, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I think going along with that too, Michelle, you were saying that there's no sacrifice in the society definition. So I think of Romans 13:10, where it says, love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. And then the Study Bible says that to love is to place another before self. This is to be a living sacrifice. And so I think, just having that sacrificial aspect to it as well is something that we need to focus on too.
Yeah.
Yeah. And definitely that's going to come up when we talk about what is a man and what is a woman, and the table of duties, right? That Luther outlines for us, Ephesians 5. Let's move on to one of those then. Let's talk about man and woman. What does God say about men and women?
Well, so to start, like, really, really fundamentally, like, God made them, right?
Yeah.
He made man, he made woman, he designed them that way. And he designed each of us as either male or female. And you kind of, you talk about identity, like, our identity comes from outside of us. It comes from God, and he tells us who we are. We don't discover that for ourselves. So he makes man and woman, and then he calls it good. He calls all of his creation good. So I think we have to like start with that baseline that he's a creator, and what he makes is good. And then I think from there you can get into some pretty cool stuff. So talking about man and woman, Paul says in Ephesians chapter 5 that marriage is this picture of Christ and the church. So that God roots this picture of the gospel in his creation of men and women. So Chris and I co-authored a book called Male and Female, Embracing Your Role in God's Design. And in there we talk about like the gender roles, right? And we did that because I feel like at least growing up I always kind of cringed when I heard gender roles and like the head and the helper and all that kind of stuff, and it was like, oh, I don't really want to talk about that kind of thing. And so we're like, well, let's lean in and see what God has for us there. And so I think what we found is like pretty cool. Like so what is a man? Like going beyond just the biological aspect, like God designs men as heads, those who will like image, because we're made in the image of God, who will image God's headship, his care for his creation, so that people can depend on him. Men image that kind of headship and care. They are dependable, right? But I think what men do is like their main job is to like lead in that dependence on God. So like Adam wasn't made as like this, macho independent, oh, I'm the man. He was fully dependent on God, and his job was to help Eve and also the rest of creation to also be dependent on God.
Yeah, one of the things that I like to talk about with when I talk about these roles, to understand headship, right, as not someone, we typically think of headship as synonymous with being in charge, right?
Mm-hmm.
But really, headship is recognizing that you have people in your charge, right? That you have people to care for, that God has placed people in your life to lead to him, right? And to care for as you are doing that leading. And I like that phrase that you have, lead independence on God, right? To lead them to him, that they might depend on him also. But it's a recognition that there is this umbrella of care, right? That a man has, and the people God gives to him under his umbrella, those are in his charge. Like those are his responsibility, right? He has been called to care for them.
I think that's a good distinction that you made. Like, I think when society thinks of people being in charge, it means that those are the people that get to do what they want to do.
Right.
And the people that are under them don't get to do what they want to do. But God doesn't make Adam to be in charge in that way, and maybe that's where we get our toxic masculinity or toxic authority kind of idea. Because so often we do misuse our authority to be selfish. But I think the way you put it is really good. Like Adam had people and creation in his charge, so that like Adam was designed to like deny himself and not always get to do what he wanted to do, but to take care of people that were in his charge.
Yeah. Now, Christa, I'm think you had something to say. I don't want to cut you off before we move on to the next one.
Well, that's okay. I think that Jonathan kind of covered it. But just, kind of going on to talking about then what God says about women, the helper role being not like a subservient role, but being a very important role and a very like empowered role. So like one thing we talk about in our book is that the same word that is used, like that helper word, is used other places in scripture most often to talk about God helping his people. So both men and women, and this is really important to know, to hold on to, is that both men and women are created in the image of God, and they image God differently, but both those traits that are distinctly masculine and the traits that are distinctly feminine are good traits that when we live out, we're pointing others to the truth of who our God is. So, like just as, the man, like Adam was supposed to lead Eve into following God's law, and he failed.
Right.
And then Jesus comes and does it perfectly, right? He does it correctly. And the way that Jesus leads is completely sacrificial, right? He lays down his life for the church. So that goes to what you were saying about that selfishness is, Jesus is the opposite of selfish, right? He is completely selfless for us. And so, men are called to treat their wives that way, right? In marriage.
Yeah, I think I was going to say the other thing with women in that helper role. I kind of like to think of that helper role as imaging God's kind of interrupting something and making it better. So
like intervention.
He intervenes. So it's kind of wild, right? Like before the fall, everything was perfect, right? Everything was the way it should be. And God was saying it was good. And the first time he says something is not good is before sin even enters into the world, which you can, make that work in your mind, right? But in a perfect world, something is not good. And it's that Eve is not there. It says that it's not good that man should be alone. Right. And so Eve is like the climax of God's creation, where he intervenes in his creation, and gives this helper, which I think is kind of cool. And maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but like it's then through Eve that that God promises the Savior who would undo the sin. So
Right.
he proves that he uses that role to intervene in the best way possible by like through her providing salvation for the world.
Right.
So in the headship, you've got a God who cares, imaging a God who cares for his creation. And in that helpership, that helper role, you've got a God who intervenes for his creation. And I think that's, I mean, when you want to get like to like the definition of men and women, at least like in the Bible, that's what the Bible kind of roots that in.
Yeah, I like that distinction, the intervention, right? That God intervenes for his people through Eve and through the line that will be born, right?
Mhm.
Obviously, she can't do it herself, right? Adam and Eve come together. But the fact that she gets to carry that life, right? Gets to continue the intervention in a very very personal, hands-on, body-on way,
Right.
and to care for them. I think too, when we have this headship and helper, that they're so necessary to each other, right? They're so you cannot beget life. You cannot have one without the other. And I when I speak to girls in particular, right, the teenage years, and there's this pushback to having a head. There's this, I don't know that I want someone over me, right? Which of course is our sinful flesh. And God says, in Genesis 3, you will basically buck against that authority, ladies. And we do, right? This idea that we would have someone over us. And yet, when we think of if headship does what headship is supposed to do, which God's word shows us is even unto death, right? Mm-hmm. That he would provide all that is needed, even unto death, for the benefit of the wife and family. How could we not want to be under a headship like that, right? Like a headship that is willing to set aside his own needs, right? To provide and to protect for our benefit, even to the point of his own sacrificial death. That's pretty powerful, right? That is the definition of love. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
But whenever I do premarital counseling for an engaged couple, the bride to be and the groom to be, right? I always take them to Ephesians chapter 5. And so if you're listening to the podcast, you could pause or whatever and to check that out. But I always have the lady read the first few verses, which always sounds like really cringy, right? It's verse 22, Ephesians 5:22. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church. His body is himself, its Savior. And then it says, now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. But at that point, the bride to be is like, why are we reading this? What in the world? And then I then have the groom to be read the next section, which is much longer, right? Verses 25 through 33. Right. And I'd say, all right, so these are job descriptions. Look how long his is, and look how intense his is. He's got to look like Jesus, who gives himself up for her, dies for his bride, glorifies his bride, and makes her holy, and then I turn to the guy and say, like the really easy way to do this would be like, say, yeah, I'd take a bullet for my wife. And like, well, yeah, that's nice. That's a good way, to go out and whatever. But can you do that every single day?
Right.
Like, and like that's what headship is. And I think when you've got a relationship like that's where the beauty comes in. And that's like, I realize I'm saying this as a guy, but I think that's the kind of guy that a bride would want to submit to.
Yeah, I think that's important. So two things. One, the Bible never says women submit to men. It says wives submit to your husbands. So right. That's really important to remember, that this is in the context of a lifelong covenantal relationship of safety. So there is not like a command for all women to always do whatever a man ever says, like this is within the context of a relationship that looks like Christ in the church. And then the other thing is that I think this is important for young people to keep in mind, like when you're considering dating. Like, I think that there is a natural desire that we have as women to be in relationships with guys who we can submit to because they are Christ-like leaders. And I guess I would say like that should be like your litmus test. Like you should not be with somebody if submission makes you cringe. That's a really good warning sign that this might not be the man for you, you know?
Yeah. And it's not submission no matter what. Like, he's supposed to look like Jesus.
Right.
And when he's doing something that doesn't look like Jesus, like, submitting to him means like calling him out and be like, hey dude, get your act together, because you're not looking like Jesus right now.
Right. And I do think, it's important too. I'm glad you brought this up too, about dating, about thinking about who you want your spouse to be, because you're right. If you can't respect your spouse, if you can't, as a woman, in some sense, look up to him as a leader, right? To allow him to lead, then it's not going to be a healthy relationship. Because it's just as common for women who are nurturers to date a guy who needs them to take care of him, right? Who needs her to take care of him. And so, you see that too. You see women who become moms, in a sense, to their boyfriends, making sure that they're cared for and taken care of. And even to the point, you see sometimes in marriages afterwards where women are doing the work and men are sitting and drinking a beer, right? Not that he can't ever sit and drink a beer, but it's important to be equally yoked. It is important for women to choose men who are men, right? Who are not going to be another kid to take care of, and who you can look up to, who you can respect, who you can submit to. Because you're right, if it feels cringy to say or impossible to submit to the guy you're dating, then probably he's not ready to be a husband.
Right. And since we're on the topic, like, God designed her to be a helper. And Chris already mentioned that usually God is the one who's referred to most as the helper in Scripture. And the word helper there carries with it like this military tone. So it's not like a weak helpership. It's not like the sidekick. It's like you're calling in backup. You're calling in like the military air support kind of help. Like, it's powerful. And God gives Eve as a gift to Adam. So Adam would be wise to pay attention to her and to let her have influence. And like God created marriage as a picture of the most foundational marriage, which is Jesus and his bride, the church. And look what Jesus does for the church. He lets us pray and have influence on him. Like, that's what prayer is. Like, we get to pray and say, hey, Jesus, we could really use this down here, right? or hey, I pray for that person that you would intervene and do something about that. So we get that influence with Jesus. And so submission does not mean like you're quiet, you're out of the way, you're always obeying no matter what. It's like, no, it's like the head might carry the primary responsibility, but he is most wise when he is seeking her influence, seeking her help, seeking her involvement, and kind of letting her have that,
And those things go really well together. The person who has primary responsibility often has a very hard time challenging the status quo because it's very scary. Like, if you could think about any like organization where you have somebody in charge, like, it's very difficult to say the really hard things because you're the boss. So like, it is important, like the helper role is every bit as important. Somebody to come in and say, look, I know I'm not the person who's going to make the final call, but I am seeing that this is going on and it is not what we are intending. That's a very important role. And you really need both, because good headship frees the helper up to feel safe, to share her insights and what she's really thinking and feeling. because she knows that that's going to be received well,
Right.
and yeah, so those things go really well together, and they're both really important.
All right. So we have kind of covered what God says about love, what he says about men and women, I think phenomenally. I think, I'm hoping we have thousands of youth that listen to this, because that would be fantastic, right? Make for a lot of good marriages. What about sex? What does God's word say about sex?
I was going to lead off and say that it is for the confines of marriage. And that is the first and foremost thing to remember in all of this, especially in our day and age that says do whatever you want as long as it feels good.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
Marriage.
It's kind of intended for marriage. I think we had to, just like we went back to the fundamental thing where God created man and woman and called it good. The same goes for our sex. Like Adam and Eve were married before the fall into sin. So marriage and sex, like that's all good and pre-fall, and how God designed the world to be, so but he did have it within that confines. He did design it for marriage. And I think the reason being is that it is like sex is created to be like the height of vulnerability with each other.
Right.
And that vulnerability requires that safety. But I think what is really cool is that even in a post-fall world, in a sinful world, sex carries a little bit of what Adam and Eve experienced with that being naked and having no shame. And he kind of gives that in marriage, where you kind of have that again. But I think that because it's such a vulnerable situation to be in, you have to have somebody who has Jesus-like commitment to you, which is why I think it's within the confines of marriage, because Jesus's kind of commitment to us is unconditional. It's non-transactional. It's not like I'll do this for you only if you do this kind of thing for me.
Right.
And it's knowing that you can be a knucklehead and Jesus is still unconditionally committed to you. And so our relationships are a picture of his kind of relationship with us. And so it's within that kind of relationship with somebody that you can have that kind of vulnerability with them, and share that with them.
So the other thing is that sex is not just about the two people having sex. It also creates children, right? And God says, do not commit adultery. So that's, the rule, right? The law, the unchanging law of God. And the reality is that in our marriages, we get to image God to our children, and we get to take care of them. And parents are the first gift that God gives each of us as children, right? Like as soon as you come into the world with two people who are supposed to take care of you. And when we separate sex from marriage, we steal from children the provision that God intends for them to have in the years when they are vulnerable. And we turn children into a commodity. And that is wrong. So that's another really important part of this. Any divorce hurts children. Anytime you lose either your father or your mother, that is traumatic for children. And so when we stick with God's design for marriage, we give a very important gift to the next generation.
Yeah. And I think too, it's important to add that just as love is sacrificial service, so too is sex. It is meant to serve the spouse, right? It is not meant to serve self. Now it's, in God's beautiful design, very often it does serve us as well. But my husband, who is also a pastor, would say that some of the healthiest marriages, or maybe some of the marriages that struggle, are those that see sex as something that is self-serving, rather than seeking to serve your spouse, rather than seeking to find pleasure in your spouse and give pleasure to your spouse. If you are even in the action, right, even in the love making, trying to serve self, then you're missing out on what it really means to love, right, and to give of yourself for the other person. When we become one, it's not just that we become one on legal paper, right? But our spouse's body, our spouse's health, our spouse's mental health, our spouse's, those are all gifts to us, and we are gifts in kind to our spouse. And withholding that gift, or misusing that gift, or not seeing the spouse as a gift, also is not as God intended. And I think it's important because society wants us to believe that sex is self-serving, that it is all about how we feel, as long as, again, it's consensual, but it is supposed to please us, right? And God has so beautifully designed that it is actually supposed to please others and us at the same time, right? So yeah, there is that element as well. What does then a woman need in a man, and what does a man need in a woman? So, Pastor, I'm going to have you answer. What does a man need in a woman?
Yeah. So I think I guess I'd start with saying like we've talked a lot about like what love is then, unlike the world's definition of love, like the biblical definition of love, you said God is love earlier, and I think that he shows us ultimately like love is dying to yourself. So Jesus dies for us, and makes us right with him. And so I think that our love kind of reflects his kind of love. So we die to ourselves, to give our lives to another. I kind of like to think to come up with like a really masculine macho way of describing this, like it's more like a death by 1,000 cuts rather than a bullet to the head, like you are living every day, dying to yourself every day for others, right? And so I think that what a man needs from a woman, that's when you asked me, right? I think that probably it's I think in marriage it's a mutual dying for the other, right? And so I think what men are benefited by, how men are benefited from their wives, is when they provide a platform for his headship, when the wives also hold their husbands to that standard of being like Jesus, and they're inevitably going to fail, and they're going to be knuckleheads. So I think being forgiven by their wives when they don't look like Jesus, but then being encouraged to, all right, pick yourself up and do it again tomorrow and look like Jesus, to point their husbands back to God's word, and to expect them to be godly, right? I think also like allowing men to be men, and I mean that in a good way. And I think that while we might not agree with all the tenets of what our world says about toxic masculinity, I think that masculinity can be toxic. And so saying, no, masculinity should look like Jesus, the manliest man of all, right? And so allow men to be men in that good way when it looks like Jesus, and also to see their uniquely masculine characteristics as good things.
Excellent. Okay, so ladies, it's our turn. What does a woman need in a man?
All right, give it to me, guy. Yeah.
Well, I think, of course, there's two different pitfalls that men can fall into, right? That is like domineering, and then there's like passivity. And I think that, so, women need their husbands to value their input and to see them as equals and to not objectify them and to treat them with respect. Like, we all know that. It almost goes without saying. But, what did Adam do in the garden? He was passive. He didn't stand up for what he knew was right. He went along. He went with the flow.
He's there the entire time, right?
Yeah.
He's the entire time.
I think that what women really need from men is men who are willing to be uncomfortable, to do the right thing, and are willing to take responsibility for the state of their homes and their families, and who are willing to admit when they're wrong and change if they need to, so people who, you want, as a man, you want to be able to tell the truth. You want to be able to say, I have let this situation get away from me and it doesn't look like what I want it to look like, and I'm going to, we need to adjust it, or can you help me come up with a better strategy, or that kind of thing. So basically, like, engaging even when it's really uncomfortable, and not being passive, which is a temptation that men often have. And it's a way that men take advantage of the helper role, because what a helper does is they look for things that need to be done and they do them out of love. And which means that most men will find themselves surrounded by women ready to, pick up the slack. And they may do it with grumbling and sass, but men are really good at tuning that out. So
no. She does not speak from experience.
Yeah, no, I've heard it said, No, but so I think taking responsibility and not resisting the urge to be passive.
Good. What would you add, Corey?
I was going to add too that, like we talked about earlier, if you are a woman who is is scared of submitting, you haven't found the right leader. So finding someone who's willing to lead you in the way that you need to be led. The relationship that you're going to have with your husband isn't going to look like the relationship that you have with your dad, or, things like that. So while the age-old adage is girls will marry someone who reminds them of their dad, you don't necessarily want to marry the man that is exactly like your dad, because maybe he was a horrible leader. So find the man that is going to lead you in the way that you need to be led, and is willing to accept that leadership role. We're talking earlier about how, we're all firstborns. Well, my husband is a thirdborn. And so his leadership is a lot more flexible. And that was something I needed. I did not need the rigidity. I needed some flexibility. And so for me, especially, finding someone who is willing to lead our family in a way that is flexible and is a lot more go with the flow and isn't going to be so rigid about things was important and really made a difference. So yeah, having that man who is going to lead you the way that you need to be led, I think also is reflective of Christ in the church.
Good.
Yeah, if I can jump in, I think that's a really good point, that like personality is a huge part of this. Yep. So like these roles are not necessarily like going to like look the same in every relationship. Like some people are going to lead quietly and other people may not notice that that's what's happening. And that doesn't mean that they're not leading, and some people are going to have like a really intense traditional kind of thing in their marriage. And then some of us might say, wow, that feels really uncomfortable. And that's like, well, that's their personality and that works for them. Like this is all like,
right.
Yeah, it can vary. So,
right. I think, the other thing I would add two things. Well, maybe three. One, just as, Pastor said, women need men who are willing to forgive as well, right? So women are going to enter into relationships. You bring two sinful people under the same roof, you are going to have sin, right? You're going to have times when both need to repent and to forgive. And I admire the fact that my husband is so good at saying, I failed, I am sorry, at initiating that, right? And asking for forgiveness. So, which again, brings my hackles down, right? And enables me to say, me too. Yeah, I forgive you, and I failed as well. Please forgive me. And so modeling that forgiveness, I think, is really important. That's and that willingness to be forgiven, to admit fault, I think is really important, because again, so many marriages fall apart when when there's a lack of forgiveness, when we can't work through problems, right? But I think about those classic things, that we look to in our wedding vows, to have and to hold, right? And part of having and holding is classically that provision, right? And I'm not saying that a mother or a wife has to stay at home and a husband has to work, right? I know that things work differently in different situations, and yet God has given women this capability of bearing children, right? And so it may be that a wife wants to continue working, but it may be also, and she didn't even know this would be the case after she has children, that she really wants to stay at home with them, right? And so if that is the case, I would hope that a husband would be willing to provide the means necessary for that to happen. Sometimes that means finding a new job. Sometimes it means cutting back on spending. There's a variety of ways that you can do that, and you can support that desire. But provision and protection, and when I think of protection too, I am not so worried about someone breaking into our home, right? Although I know that if someone did, I'm sure my husband would jump out of bed after he finally woke up to protect us. But part of that protection is also from the world and from sin and from the emotional trials of the world, right? So it's not just about the physical needs, but also the talking through of, with the worries, the emotional needs. My husband is also a pastor, and he is, and I'm thankful for this. He does not bring home the underbelly of the church, right? He does not bring home those emotional hardships and spill them at my feet. And that is one of the ways that he chooses to protect me, so that I might, as a pastor's wife, be able to go to church and find the gifts of God, right? The word and the sacraments, and to rejoice in the community that the church provides. Now, I'm also intelligent enough to know that it's not a perfect place, right? It is a hospital for sinners. But at the same time, that is one way that I know that he protects me and he protects our family, and by preventing unnecessary worry or hardship in that area. And so, yeah, I think that's valuable in a man. Again, sometimes he needs that encouragement. Sometimes it's too much to hold, but it's also not a dumping ground at home.
Right. Good.
So, yeah. What about what can young people do to prepare for, I guess, for manhood, womanhood, and love itself? What are your thoughts?
One thing I always got told was to make the list and keep it in your Bible and pray over it. And I don't know how accurate that is to life anymore, but think of the things that you want your spouse to have in terms of what you need to support you, and what is going to be the best reflection of Christ in the church in your relationship, right? So pray over those things. Like, you want a strong spiritual leader. You don't want someone who's going to be very wishy-washy on what the Bible has to say. And you can pray over other things, like, oh, I wish he was taller than me. Like, yeah, you can pray over that, but God might not have that in mind for you. But God will have in mind for you the person who's going to be, if you're a woman looking for a man who's going to be the strong spiritual leader for your house, or if you're a man looking for a woman who's going to be there to help through all those situations and be your helper. So I would just, pray over those things and read what the Bible has to say about, being a husband or being a wife.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think kind of going with like the last thing you said there, you are already uniquely created to image God to those around you. And your maleness or your femaleness is part of that gifting, and so I think you don't need to be afraid of that. You can embrace that. I think that women, if I can say this as a guy, right? Women, don't be afraid of wanting to get married and have babies. I think that many times, like, our world says, no, you got to get out there. You got to, like, be independent. You got to get a big person job, and like that's how you establish adulthood. And like, that's all okay. That's great. But it's also a beautiful gift to that God has given us, that you can have children. And so, like, Chris and I, we got married young. I guess I'd also say that like it is okay to get married young. Chris and I got married after our first year of college, and it's awesome. And I think that when you get married young, it's actually a gift that you give to your spouse, where you're letting them have the opportunity to shape you as you're still growing. I know for me as a pastor, I've had young couples come to me in the past and say, "Hey, pastor, we've been dating for a while. Are we allowed to get married, or how long do we have to wait?" Or and it's like, yeah, I think it's okay to consider that marriage, and I mean, I think that maybe getting married young isn't for everyone, but if you have the opportunity and you have the right person, like that's okay. Like that's a gift that God has given. I guess I would also say on the flip side too, like, singleness is also a thing, and that's okay. Like, you shouldn't feel pressured to get married if you don't have that person. You shouldn't feel pressured to get married as if something is wrong with you if you're single, because you bear the full image of God as a person, whether male or female. And it's like, not like you need a spouse in order to be fully human, as if you're only like part human if you're not.
So, it's important, like, if you want to be married and you're not, you can pray for that, and that's totally fine to do. But that's not, like, God has not promised us that we will get married, right? So that is something that God may or may not give to us. But Paul says that singleness is also a calling and a gift to the church. And something that we are promised is that God has prepared good works for us to do. Mm-hmm. And so everyone today, exactly as you are, in whatever, like, relationship status or phase of life you're in, you're an important part of the church. And there are people that God has put in your life for you to serve and to minister to, who need you and your, maleness and femaleness to image God to them. And so, like, it's okay to want things. Like, it's okay to want to be married, or to want, if you are married, it's okay to want to have babies. We're created that way, and we're designed that way, but the world is fallen and we may not get those things. And so it's important for us to remember that those things are gifts, right? Right. And that we receive the gifts that God gives us with gratitude, and we are patient when they are not given.
Right. That's how we prepare to love for life. When we love for life, we don't just love our spouse for life, but we love the people that God has brought into us through our vocations, right? He has given us so many vocations where we can share, where we can learn to love, and to do that lifelong. And so you're right. I'm so glad that we were able to bring up singleness and this desire, and these desires are good. And they may not all be given. And that too, we know even then, God is working in our lives for good, and he is working through us for good in the lives of others. We can be confident in that. I think one more thing too is just to recognize that God doesn't have a specific person in mind for you for marriage. He does know who you're going to choose, right? But he gives you the opportunity to choose whether or not to get married, to choose which spouse you're going to marry, and to do so trusting that, again, even in this decision, God will work good in your life. So don't wait for the whisper, right? Go into it with your eyes open, and relationships with your eyes open, and with the truth that God loves you, that he will bless you through whomever you choose to marry. Well, thanks so much for joining me for this message, for this episode of Table Talks for Life. It was such a pleasure to have both of you on, and thanks, Corey, for joining me as we hosted this. And for those of you who are listening, we hope that maybe we've answered some questions, or at least given you some things to talk about with your pastors, with your parents. Please like this podcast, pass it on to others, and we hope to see you next time on Table Talks for Life. Thanks for joining the Y4Life team for today's Table Talk for Life. We hope you're better equipped to address today's life issues and uphold the people God has placed in your path. Be sure to check out our programs and resources at y4life.org, or email Michelle at y4life.org to find out more about how you can be a gospel-motivated voice for life. And we hope you'll join us next time, right here at Youth for Life Podcast.